Behind me is the Church of Nativity. Many people believe this marks the place where Jesus was actually born. When you raise the question, who was Jesus? Most people will readily say, he was a good man. After all, think about the things he said and the things he did. But if you then bring in another question, was Jesus God? You get a much different reaction from many people. They're willing to say he was good, but they're not really willing to say he was God. C.S. Lewis, who was perhaps the greatest apologist in the previous century, basically said for us to consider Jesus requires us to put him in one of three, and I would actually say four categories. Lewis said either he was a liar, he was a lunatic, or he was the Lord. And I think you could add a fourth option, and that is he was a legend. In other words, he was a liar. He was not who he claimed to be, and he knew it. Perhaps he was a lunatic. He was not who he thought he was, and he just didn't know it. Maybe he was a legend. Some in the liberal world of scholarship will often say that Jesus was embellished later by his disciples or those who followed the teaching of Christianity, pushing it back into the late first or usually into the second century. But there is a fourth option, that is, he is the Lord. He was who he said he was, and there's an event that proves it beyond any question. That event is the resurrection. But you know, there are several ways to get at this particular question. For example, if you go to John's Gospel, in John chapter 1, he writes in verse 1, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." He then says in verse 14, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld His glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth." And then he concludes what is called John's prologue in verse 18, and he says it this way, "No man has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, who's in the bosom of the Father, He has made Him known." So John, who was one of His disciples, said, this man is God. Or you can go to the writings of Paul, who says in Philippians chapter 2, verse 6, that he existed in the very nature or essence of God. Again, in Colossians chapter 1 and verse 15, Paul tells us he is the image of the invisible God. In other words, Jesus made visible the God who is a spirit and the God who is invisible. And even the author of Hebrews says that God in the past spoke at many times and in many ways through the prophets, but in these last days, He has spoken to us by His Son. But you know, there's another way to get at this question. What did Jesus say about Himself? In other words, what were His self-claims? Well, again, if you go to John's Gospel, you find Jesus saying, "He who has seen me has seen the Father. The Father and I are one." Those are incredible claims. You put those statements in the mouths of anyone else, and it really makes no sense at all. In fact, it almost sounds insane. But you put those words in the mouth of Jesus, and they make perfectly good sense because of who He was and what He did. But there's even another statement that perhaps is even more, I believe, profound than that. It's where in John 8:58, Jesus says this, "Before Abraham was, I am." You need to understand that what He is doing there is quoting Exodus chapter 3 and verse 14. And there, the God who is known as Yahweh, who delivered the Hebrew children from Egypt, reveals Himself to Moses, and Jesus is claiming that He is that God. But here's the bottom line. I believe the question of was Jesus God is settled by one particular thing, the resurrection. If Jesus was raised from the dead and stayed alive, then He is God. So the question is, what will you do with this one who claimed to be God and proved He was God by His resurrection from the dead?